It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. With me today, Conservative MP and Chair of the Transport Select Committee, Hugh Merriman, Labour peer, Shami Chakrabarti, The Spectator's economics editor, Kate Andrews, and Alva Ray of Politico. Today is day 2 of the rail strike. Trains once again grind to a halt as workers walk out over pay and conditions.
The men and women of our union are standing on picket lines because they need a square deal from the employer.
But the government says the railways must modernise or there's no deal. Also today, as he arrives in Rwanda, the Prime Minister says critics of his asylum plan are being condescending. Is he right? Is the government about to give the go-ahead for a new coal mine here in Cumbria? And it's 6 years since this. Is Britain taking full advantage of Brexit? All that to come, but first of all, let's start with this story and headline in The Times. Rich pensioners should return cash, says Work and Pension Secretary Therese Coffey. This follows the news that the government is going to reinstate, as it said it would do after a pause, the pension triple lock. It was paused during the pandemic, and the triple lock means that the state pension will rise by whatever is highest, average earnings, inflation, or 2.5%. Inflation will, of course, be the highest, possibly around 10%. So my question to you is, should rich pensioners return the cash? Hugh?
Well, I'm not really in the habit of telling people what they should do with the money that they're entitled to. And I think Therese was responding to Ken Clarke, who said that he didn't need it. And she said, well, in that case, write me a cheque, Ken. So I think it was more sort of flippantly said. But there's a serious point here, which is that we had the triple lock in place. We took it away for a year because it would have shown a 7% pay increase, or pension increase, I should say, at a time when that was just a sort of blip from furlough. But actually, fast forward, because that was September, when the rate was actually paid in April, inflation was actually running at 7.8%. So arguably, we should have given pensioners more than we did for this coming year. So I think it's right, when we come to this September, that we use that inflation rate for the following year. Arguably, there's such a big, long gap between September and April that we're not properly setting it. So I think we could perhaps close that gap. But, you know, to come back to the original point, then I think it's down to people to decide what they do with their money that they're entitled to. Would
you encourage rich pensioners to hand back cash? Is it justifiable for the triple lock, with inflation running at possibly 10% to upbreak pensions? Is it justifiable they get that much?
I'm not into turning generations against each other. So the way I would put it is this. If there are people of whatever age who have a lot of wealth, and let's remember that during the pandemic, there were some people who were able to sit at home and watch the investments go up. That should be taxed. But the state pension is a vital safeguard for a lot of poor pensioners, including people who eat dog food to get by in difficult times. So I don't think, you know, jokes between, ministers and Ken Clarke are one thing. If you believe that some people have way too much wealth and others have not enough, there are ways of raising that in taxation.
Kate?
If the government is acknowledging that it has a system in place which is a heck of a lot of money, that is giving payments to people who fundamentally don't need it, who are in many cases very, very wealthy, we need to change the system.
So what, get rid of the triple lock?
The triple lock has been a really unfair policy at the expense of younger generations for a long time. Suspending it was a good start. This was the opportunity to actually reform it. I think it's a real shame, acknowledging that they're going to be giving handouts to wealthy people, that it's coming back in its current form.
What do you think, Alva?
Well, there's always a bit of a tension, isn't there, between targeting support and doing a sort of very complicated policy to really identify who needs support, and then keeping it a bit more simple, but then inevitably having some people who don't necessarily need the support. And I bet Therese Coffey hated Ken Clarke saying this, and that was just her way of sort of getting past him drawing attention to the slight inefficiencies within this system. But there are about 18% of pensioners are in poverty right now, and we don't think about it so much because we look at the sort of the inequalities in housing and property ownership between generations. But I think that it's maybe less about pensioners not needing the support, and more about the way this shines a quite awkward spotlight on the way pensioners are getting a pay boost essentially in line with inflation, while lots of other workers aren't getting that at the moment. I think that leaves the government in a tricky situation for the next few months.
Well, that's a pertinent point because it leads us into the rail strikes. Let me just show you this story in BBC News. Rail strike. Law change would allow agency staff to cover industrial action. It is the second day of the strike this week in the dispute over pay and condition. It's the largest of its kind in decades. Now, the government wants to try and introduce this measure to limit the impact of future strikes. It would need approval from Parliament. Is it a good idea, Hugh?
I think if you look at the strikes, then the skilled part of the network, so signallers, where it takes 12 months to train up, that can bring the railway to a halt, and it has done. So I'm not entirely sure the agency would fix that. The department has certainly pointed to a number of days of strike action that would be averted with agency. If we're going to reform anything through Parliament, then you're looking, in my view, more at minimum service levels that they have in France, Italy, Spain, where you have to run a certain number of trains, so a third to a fifth of all trains in those countries. Then that, to me, would make more sense to actually try and have a balance between the right to strike and also the right for people to get about their lawful business. Has
the government been a bit slow off the mark with that?
Well, that has been in our manifesto, as indeed has the agency part before, and hasn't been legislated. So, in a sense, you normally get something like that in line, so that you're then ready and prepared. So it's been much talked about and actually not really delivered. Of course, there would be the challenge of getting the minimum service level through the House of Lords, so that's probably been uppermost in their mind.
I mean, we're also expecting the GMB union to announce the results of a strike ballot of BA check-in and ground staff at Heathrow for later this year. Are both those things, but particularly agency staff coming in to replace striking workers, is that a long-term solution?
No. I don't think that breaking people's rights to strike and undermining collective bargaining is a good way to sit down in partnership with people who make a vital contribution to our lives and to our economy. So this is very confrontational. This is the government's divide and rule approach to everything at the moment, and including undermining all our rights in yesterday's rights removal bill.
Right. I mean, before I get to UK, is it part of a divide and rule strategy by the government?
I think it's part of an attempt to try and make sure that our railways run for people that need it. And if it's good enough for Europe, then why can we not have it in this country?
Kate?
Well, people absolutely have the right to strike, and I think the public is also entitled, given the fact that they have to get to work in the morning and they have to catch their flights, for the government to bring in agency workers to try to fill that gap. I'm actually more comfortable with the agency workers than I am with some mandate that you have to run a minimum amount of service, because, if a union votes to go on strike, and they can go about that the way they see fit, but it is absolutely right that other workers who want to fill the gap should be able to do so. To your point, Joe, of course it's not a long-term solution. I mean, it's designed to be a short-term solution, hopefully in a very short period in which you're having strikes. Agency workers come in to help things. I suspect the government's going to find public opinion possibly on its side sooner rather than later. I mean,
it's mixed at the moment, isn't it, in terms of the strike, anyway?
It's mixed at the moment, but when you think about which workers are going on strike right now, we've just had 2 years in which certainly not everybody, but a lot of people have become comfortable and learned how to work from home very easily. But if you start getting teachers, nurses going on strike, as sympathetic as you might be to their pay, to Alva's point earlier, all these other people are struggling from inflation as well, and they're not seeing their pay go up with the rate of inflation either.
Well, Kate mentions teachers,
yeah.
And that could be possibly the next stage, and getting supply teachers to come in. It's been roundly criticised, actually, by the Recruitment and Employment Federation, which represents the recruitment industry. But would it work as a stopgap?
Well, exactly. This is the problem. I mean, it's not just the politics, which we just sort of heard about, of sort of whether this is undermining, the right to collectively bargain. But actually, we have a shortage of supply teachers at the moment already. So I think, this idea that there'll be tons of supply teachers, an army of them ready to fill in when teachers go on strike is just kind of ludicrous. I mean, maybe it's a vaguely appropriate response to this precise strike, but I think when you look at the summer that we have potentially in store with strikes in loads of different sectors, it's not as though we have loads of supply barristers who are ready to to line up in court. It's just silly.
I mean, the government's made it clear in general that any pay rises, but specifically actually in this case to the railway staff that are striking, it has to be linked to modernisation. Kate, does the railway need to modernise?
Well, it certainly does, and especially post-COVID. Again, we're talking about a very particular sector, and this isn't going to apply to everyone that might go on strike this summer. But when it comes to the railways, we have fundamentally changed how we work, where we work, when we work. There's talk now about doing rail works actually during the week, because fewer people are commuting on certain days and actually coming in on the weekends. So not only do we need to modernize, I think we seriously need to rethink the kinds of investment and the kinds of plans that were set up for rail. And again, I think, you know, the RMT has clearly made their choice and they're welcome to strike, but calling attention to the fact that the Tories were actually going to invest a lot in rail, when arguably they don't need to do so as much, may have medium to long-term ill effects for those who are going on strike.
Well, you're chair of the Transport Select Committee. You were nodding away there. What does modernisation look like?
Well, I was nodding away to Kate's point about Sundays. More people are using Sunday services than they were before the pandemic, whereas during the week, only 6% of commuters are going back to a 5-day commute. So the rail, in order to grow and actually just to keep going, needs its weekends. So I agree with that. But actually, you can take it one stage further. There's a lot of work that goes on the track by individuals, by workers, that is actually dangerous to them and not needed because technology can do it better. So I've talked before about a sensor under a carriage that can record 70,000 pictures per minute to check for cracks. So it's better. You don't have to shut the railway down. It's safer. And that's the kind of efficiency which will also give the workers a pay rise. So it should be a win for everyone if we make these changes.
Shami, do you agree? Or is it a case that modernisation will inevitably lead to job losses?
Not inevitably. I think what people are afraid of is when modernisation is used as a euphemism for undermining people's terms and conditions and cutting lots of jobs. I think that people are open to investment in train and track. In many cases, it's vitally needed, and I think people are happy to do different jobs, but what they don't want is modernisation used as a euphemism for just treating them really badly, treating them like dirt, cutting their jobs, cutting their pay in real terms.
Hugh?
So I agree with Shami. I think the point we need to make is that there's a real future in rail. You think of all of the investment going to rail, there will be more jobs. HS2, if you look at Crossrail, it's just obviously open. So we need to demonstrate to the workforce how we're going to improve their skills, so there'll still be a job for them, and indeed a higher paid job. And I think we've got to take people with us, and that's the danger when strikes get very political. It looks as if we're trying to undermine the workforce, whereas I'm actually trying to make an argument that we can make it a better and safer job for them.
Right, Ian Martin, writing in The Times, says robots are coming for trade union dinosaurs. That runs counter to what we've just heard there, really, from Hugh and Shami.
Yeah, I think it's difficult, and I'm sure that this is the sort of the unspoken fear that lots of people who work in this industry are worried about at the moment. That and that goes across sectors. You know, when you go to the airport now, you don't necessarily need a human being to check you in. You do it yourself. Like, there's so many jobs like this, like automation. It's not just really with the railways, but there's just so many sectors where workers might find their jobs at risk, and I don't think that really anyone's having a very honest conversation about it. I think it's really politically difficult. Well, yeah.
No, I take that point, and this is where government has to say people have to live. Yeah. And robots and mechanisation should be used to make everybody's life better, but people still need to live. So they need alternative employment, or they need some kind of basic income. But what we cannot have is robots servicing the super rich and other people starving. That is not what we want in a decent country, one of the wealthiest on earth in the 21st century.
It's always going to be a real challenge post-lockdown, because lockdown fundamentally transformed many different sectors of the economy, and it accelerated certain trends we were already seeing, say working from home, say automation, and it did so really, really quickly. And I don't think anybody properly prepared for the conversations we were going to have with workers in particular sectors who became significantly vulnerable to the timeline, because something that might have happened over 10 years happened in 2. And we've never had a conversation about that. It's very difficult to plan for them. It is one of the many, many, many consequences of the decision to shut down our domestic economy and kickstart it multiple times that we're just now starting to wrap our heads around. And it's going to have consequences possibly for decades.
Right. I mean, is the government being honest? Are politicians being honest about this type of conversation, that there will be job losses? Are these well-founded fears by trade union bosses about what's coming down the track, to coin a phrase?
Well, we've always been honest that we've got a real productivity problem in this country. We're about 15% below the US and France. And actually, funnily enough, the pandemic and actually the way that it's changed people's working practices. Certain businesses have actually gone out and it's just changed the fashion. The pandemic may give us a chance to actually improve our productivity. So I think we need to talk about productivity improvements, and that actually if we take people with us, then there will be a bright future for them, because we will always need a workforce and we'll always need people to
But will it be a smaller workforce? That's the point. I mean, the government keeps talking about a high-wage economy. Does that mean fewer jobs and the remaining workers get paid more?
Well, look at us right now. We have 1.2 million job vacancies out there. I mean, this is the time for the workforce as far as that's concerned. So, certainly that's what you're talking about, Jo, is a luxury that we really don't have right now. Yeah. So, this should be the time when wages are increasing. But then that's the challenge for the public sector, that if we can afford them and we don't cause inflation to spiral, we've got to get productivity gains from those sectors.
Is that about productivity? That should be the key.
Well, it depends how you look at productivity, and also how you look at who has to pay the price of inflation. There are some people who have a hell of a lot of money, and nobody's saying that they should take pay cuts as the bosses of these various companies that now face strikes. You have to share these burdens. In terms of mechanisation and productivity and so on.
Yes.
We could be working a shorter week, so that everybody shares the work and shares the benefits of the work. There are so many things that we can do if people trust that as a nation we're actually going to take this on together.
I remember we were talking about by 2020 we'd all be working a 4-day week, and it's not happened. And if you look at our productivity already, if you actually pay people the same 5-day wage for working 4, then to me that will actually get even worse, nice though it may be.
All right, well, the Prime Minister has arrived in Rwanda this morning for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. He's due to hold talks with none other than the Prince of Wales. It'll be the first time since it emerged that Prince privately described the planned deportation of some asylum seekers to the country as appalling. You can see it here in the Daily Telegraph. The Prime Minister to tell Prince Charles he is proud of migrant plan, which HRH called appalling. Boris Johnson has also hit out at critics of the policy, saying that some of those are condescending attitudes towards Rwanda. Is it true critics have a condescending view? Do you agree with the Prime Minister?
Well, not for the first time. I wouldn't necessarily use that same language. I know the way I look at the Rwandan policy is that I find it troubling in the sense that we would actually put people from our country to another when they've come over. But equally, I can't sit there saying it's not enough that 28,000 people can cross. 50 people lost their lives last year, and we don't do anything bold about it. Nothing else has worked. No alternatives from critics have come forward that would work. And I'm a South Coast MP, so I absolutely get this. And when I've gone around the world and seen what our amazing aid actually does, when I've spoken to people, they've said you've got to stop people moving and risking their lives and actually invest the money in the countries and the regions where people are. And so there's a compassionate reason for saying we've got to bring in a strong deterrent in order to try and stop people from drowning or stop people smugglers making money out of people's misery.
But are critics of the policy being condescending towards Rwanda? Because Rwanda is the place that some asylum seekers will be sent to claim and make their asylum claims.
Look, I use my own language. And so I think the point more is actually people are concerned about going from such a long distance from people who come from France to UK and then all of a sudden they're in Rwanda. I get that, but my point is if you don't do something bold and actually what comes across as quite harsh, the bleeding hearts don't actually save the lives. And so as far as I'm concerned, we need strength in this policy. It's uncomfortable for many, as I say, it is a little for me. But we've got to bring a deterrent in, otherwise people continue to lose their lives in that channel.
Are you the bleeding heart here, Shami?
Guilty as charged.
All right, well, there you go. Wear it as a badge of honour. I mean, the Prime Minister said it's an opportunity for us all to understand what the partnership with Rwanda has to offer, what Rwandans have to offer, and help to shed some of those condescending attitudes towards the country.
So let's call it, let's talk Turkey here. Boris Johnson and Priti Patel are effectively accusing people like me and no doubt the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Prince of Wales of being racist towards Rwanda, which is an enormous cheek, given that this policy, this two-tier refugee policy, where we will do one special plan for Ukrainians but something different for Afghans or Syrians or whatever, that is an inherently racist policy. So let me be clear. I object to offshoring asylum seekers wherever you offshore them to, whether it's an African country or a European country. I don't approve of that, and I think it's contrary to the Refugee Convention, which was the world's apology for the Holocaust. So I'd be against it whether it was Rwanda or anywhere else. As for Rwanda, if you look at the United States' recent State Department report, in addition to Amnesty reports and Human Rights Watch reports, there are real questions to be asked about the state of human rights in Rwanda and whether people will will be treated properly there.
Could it work, though, as a deterrent in that sense? And is it condescending to criticise the plan towards Rwanda?
Of course it's not condescending. To Shami's point, people who are upset about this policy wouldn't want to see asylum seekers being shipped off anywhere. They are coming to the UK, and it's the UK's responsibility to handle them with care. You know, I have to say, to Hugh's point, there is one policy that hasn't been tried, and I know this Conservative government isn't going to try it, but if you really care about those lives being lost in the Channel, if you really want to save them, give them a legal pathway to come here. Give them the opportunity to apply from Calais, from France, wherever it is, and to take safe passage over. That is how we save lives, and I know that that does not gel with the current Conservative thinking. But to be clear, offshoring people, as Shami says, to Rwanda or anywhere else is not the only option here. And we don't necessarily have to talk about... The reality is, if you are getting in that small boat, it is not because you on a fluke decided to do that. It is because you have decided that where you are and what you're doing is no longer sustainable. And if you try to shut off one path, as we saw with the Vietnamese migrants who so tragically died in the back of that lorry, they'll find even more dangerous ways to come here because that is the end goal. If we're really caring about lives, we come up with a thoughtful policy to help people do this through the legal route. And, you know... All
right, well, let you respond.
Yeah, it's not so simple as to say this is our only option.
I think it's a classic example when you're an MP. And, you know, my situation, when I first became an MP 7 years ago, there were 1,200 people on the waiting list for housing in one district council I represent. That figure's gone up to over 1,800. And so we've got a huge number of people that we're currently not being able to service and help. So the idea that we can just say, well, that's fine, here's a legal route to come across, we'll actually help you come across, and then we'd be able to service it all. We wouldn't be able to service the people coming or others.
So it's, you know, private sector companies. Tesco doesn't have a problem feeding these people. It's all public policy in the remit of the government. Housing, education, where we have problems.
About the costs of being unable to find money in the public sector.
Hang on. Let you respond and I'll come back up.
And you have to remember also, a lot of people come here have incredibly large challenges, what they've managed to flee. So again, if we look at Kent and Sussex, where I am, it's not just a question of, well, here you come, here's a job, go and work. These are people that need huge amounts of support, language barrier issues, the schools. I get this because I'm an MP and I have to represent the challenges, because 6 months later people say to me, my school is oversubscribed now. And what you've just said, which sounds great, in reality, of course, that's a huge amount of problems, and also wouldn't be fair to the people coming over.
I'm going to come back to you in just a minute. I just want to bring Alva in. This issue of France being a safe country where people could lodge asylum claims rather than travelling through France, getting into those boats and making that crossing, is that valid?
Well, it's sort of the go-to argument, I suppose, but I think, you know, as Kate said, if you're getting into that boat and you're like desperate to reach the UK, you know, fleeing whatever, I think that's sort of a bit of a distraction from the main point, which is that there's no literally safe legal route to get to the UK. I mean, what if you like just literally don't speak French, yes, and like, or you have some sort of community already in the UK? I think it's like perfectly valid to want to seek asylum in the UK. But actually, just sort of coming back to the earlier discussion, I just think it's so interesting the slight discomfort from Hugh talking about this in his first answer, in particular, because this is really a policy for Tory MPs, exactly like you, that, aside from all of the human rights concerns that Shami has outlined, it's not even clear it's going to work. It's really because Priti Patel has been really struggling with this issue. There's still like a problem with immigration figures going up, which the Conservative Party has kind of promised not to be doing. There's a problem that they haven't really tackled the small boats crisis. This is just a talking point, really, and even like the fact that the government has handed Hugh and his colleagues a talking point that actually is really uncomfortable to defend on the airwaves kind of defeats the point of it. It's not even politically useful, because if people,
Well, there are. I've had. Hang on, but what about the deterrent? Because no Labour politician has been able to come up with me anyway on this programme with a viable alternative of how to stop people, smugglers, taking people on that dangerous journey across the Channel.
Well, you heard. If people take Ukraine, the British people have opened their hearts and their homes to people from Ukraine. And if we can't take that moment to try and change the conversation about asylum more generally...
So you were saying it would be unlimited?
I'm not saying it... on one level, you know, there isn't a limit on human misery on the planet.
So it would be unlimited. So you would explain that to people, it would be unlimited numbers.
We need to go back to working in partnership with other countries in the developed world, with our European neighbours and others, to do some sharing of the burden. Now, obviously, that's become very difficult in recent times because the government is also in a war of words with Europe.
Has it ever worked in terms of collaboration with other EU countries?
Well, we did have the Dublin Convention, and there was collaboration there, and of course that's all come.
Well, very few actually went back in terms of the Dublin Convention. But the one thing I would say, in terms of being uncomfortable, it's because by and large, I will always sort of welcome immigration, and it's a long way to say people are going to go to. But I'm not uncomfortable in terms of we have to bring in bold policies if we're really going to fix this. Tinkering around the edges doesn't. And the other ethical bit in this is that the people that tend to come over to the country or come over to Europe, they tend to be people that are the middle class, young, fit. What about thinking about the countries that are being left behind? Who's going to look after that country? So it's great for us. We get a doctor, but a doctor has just been lost in an incredibly poor and challenged part of the world. We just think, oh, that's great. We can have it all. What about the rest of the world?
Yes,
I've seen that in the Syrian border when I went there, and it does worry me.
The government's cut to the aid budget then, because surely, like that's the hint in all of your comments, that if you want to, stop people coming here in the first place, creating refugees, maybe the answer is a generous aid budget, abroad.
Well, so the aid budget is going back up to 0.7, and so I was only willing to support the temporary drop because of the COVID. The same way the triple lock went to a double, we also had to do something on the aid budget. So I'm delighted it's going back up.
All right. Let's move on. Let me just show you this story. BBC News, again. Johnson hints, Boris Johnson, that new coal mine for Cumbria will get the go-ahead. This is a decision expected next month on whether it will be given the green light, in spite of the government's commitments to net zero. You may remember back in November, the Prime Minister was pressed upon precisely this issue and this question by the BBC's climate editor, Justin Rowlatt, on the government's attitude to coal. Let's take a listen.
Sorry, I've answered the coal question, and they understand that.
Directly.
And let me tell you directly,
okay.
we are...
Yes or no on the coal mine? You personally, what do you reckon?
I'm not in favour of more coal, let's be absolutely clear, but it's not a decision for me.
Well, a few months later, in fact, yesterday, at Prime Minister's Questions, in an answer to a question by the Conservative MP Chris Green, the Prime Minister gave a heavy hint that his attitude might have changed.
Mr. Speaker, I think we can all be proud of the way we've reduced CO2 emissions in this country, but plainly it makes no sense to be importing coal, particularly for metallurgical purposes, when we have our own domestic resources.
Hugh, should it go ahead?
Well, metallurgical coal is used for steel, and so we import it, and 40% of it comes from Russia. So I guess the point is, if you can actually get it from your own reserves under the Irish Sea, rather than importing it in, because it's particular to steel, then why wouldn't you? I would certainly agree that it sends out a mixed signal, because we are reducing our reliance on coal down to zero for the energy mix by 2024. But we still have a steel industry, so that's where it would be used for. Question actually whether it would be the right quality for them to be able to use. I think only Tata would use it. British Steel think it doesn't actually hit the quality threshold. So we'll have to see what happens. All
right, better than importing it?
I think it's a terrible idea. I think that the planet is on fire and we're killing our children and grandchildren, and the emergency started long ago. And
but we'd have to shut our steel industry down on that basis.
Well, I'm not sure I accept that, because you yourself has said that parts of the British steel industry won't even. No,
but they still use coal.
I think that this coal is going to be exported to other places, and then they can.
But is it better than importing coal from Russia?
Well, if you really want to stick it to Putin long term, if you really want to, to talk Turkey with Russia and China, we should be reducing our dependency on coal. We should be investing in ingenuity and alternative energy sources, and we should have done this longer ago. And it's my generation, our generation, that hasn't done enough of it, and I feel I owe a debt to their generation.
Hugh?
Yeah, I'm probably in the same age bracket as Shami, so I was included there. But look, we've got our renewables up from 7% of the energy mix to 40%. We're doing a good job, but we still use coal for steel. So we can't say, yes, we support a steel industry, but we're not going to use coal, and then, let's bring it in, but, from other countries, so we don't have to pretend we're doing it ourselves. Surely it's better to take it out of our ground rather than actually some despot that would actually try and harm us with the monies that we pay them, a la Putin.
All right, Boris Johnson, of course, said he wasn't in favour of more coal. That didn't rule it out completely. recently. That was at the time of the COP26 climate conference. Right. Do you think he's about to change his mind?
It seems that way. I mean, it was an awkward time for him to have been asked about coal, an awkward time to be opening up coal mines. But context here matters. The Prime Minister needs to explain it. This coal mine is not going to be used for general energy use. It is going to be used so we don't have to export, which, by the way, has carbon emission issues of its own. Sorry, so we don't have to import, which has carbon emission costs of its own. Look, there are broader questions here about the British steel industry, about the fact that we're, choosing to subsidise this, choosing to open the coal plant. Is this the right decision? There are broader questions here about the fact that we're dealing with a very serious cost of living crisis, and we're talking about this technical point about opening up a coal mine for a steel industry. I mean, so much of that is connected to the energy crisis. So I think it's a bit more of a distraction than anything else, but context matters.
I mean, there's a problem with importing steel, but the irony is that we would be exporting 85% of the coal from this mine anyway. And the problem is that steel firms need to stop using coal by 2035 anyway, and they're already taking the steps to make that happen. So I just don't think that this really is a sort of necessary interim measure, and you kind of need to see it within the context of the recent politics. What has changed since Boris Johnson was talking about this at COP? The political temperature on him has increased, and it probably won't be a bad thing to say we're creating 500 jobs in Cumbria, especially when there's a sort of feeling of great nostalgia, understandably, for the mining industries there historically, and when the government also has these commitments on levelling up, but it's just not compatible with any sort of long-term strategy on steel, let alone on climate.
But we have also had yet another example of real focus on what we're importing, right? So during COVID, we had all this emphasis on supply chains. Where do we get our PPE? Where do we get all of our equipment? And then since Russia's horrible war against Ukraine, we have major questions about where we get our energy, where we get our steel, where our imports are coming from again. So I think this focus on self-reliance is just going to become a more and more important issue. And the UK has to ask, are we actually making the right trade-offs for this country? Or are we doing something for political purposes? And I think that's obviously where the grey area is.
Well, I think I'm listening to everyone and feeling more and more concerned that this government just doesn't have a plan.
Oh, well, I think governments always have to react to events, and what we've had is Russia, where 40% of this coal comes from, and also a feeling that we should be reliant on ourselves rather than funding countries that would actually do us and their neighbours harm. That's what's changed, and it's right that government looks at it. But hydrogen is the future. But the future with hydrogen is some way off in terms of green hydrogen. So you're right, the steel makers will actually shift there, but they're not there yet, and we can't shut our steel industry down.
Shami?
We can make all the excuses we like, but time is running out. Time has run out. The planet is on fire, and we cannot have it on our conscience that we are still about to open up new coal production in the UK.
I mean, how does it look with the government's commitment to net zero? You said it was a mixed message. Is it really just that? Can it be explained in the context that both Kate and Alva have set out when Boris Johnson himself has made it such a critical part of the government's agenda?
Yeah, so it's net zero by 2050, and it will take us the time to get there. And if you look at coal in the production of energy, it was around about 75% in the 90s, and it's now down to, I think about 4%, and it will go to zero by 2024. So that's great progress. I'm optimistic about this, not least I see this in the transport field with the innovators I go and meet and work with. They're doing incredible things that 10 years ago would have been unthinkable. I have great faith in the scientists, the engineers, to actually continue to deliver the solutions. We will see hydrogen in steel, but it won't be yet, and we can't shut our steel industry down, so we need the coal.
And what about the iconography of doing this, of opening up a new coal plant for our leadership on the world stage? How are you going to tell poorer countries, developing countries, that they shouldn't go down this path when we're doing it ourselves? I think it's a very, you said yourself, it's a mixed message. I think it's a catastrophically mixed message.
Well, that's why I think it needs to be explained exactly why, and that it's specific. It's not going into the energy mix, that will be zero. It's specific to steel production. We still have steel production. We need to ensure that we continue to produce our own goods so that we are not reliant on countries that will do us harm. And I think that's the culture shift that's happened over the last 6 months, finally.
Right, and that decision is expected next month, in a few weeks' time, in fact, on the 7th of July, from Michael Gove, the Cabinet Minister. It's been 6 years since the EU referendum. Hasn't time flown? That was when the UK voted to leave the European Union. There you go. Campaigners and activists celebrating at the time. But have the opportunities been realised, as promised certainly by this government? Let's have a listen to the former Brexit Minister, David Frost.
Is Brexit working? That's my exam question. And I'll cut to the chase and probably not surprise any of you by saying up front that I think it is working. I don't think we have any cause for regret about the decision the country's taken. And the solutions to the remaining problems that we have are not to be found in going backwards, but they're to be found in completing the process. Although most of the hard work is done, Brexit is not complete yet. There are things still to do.
David Frost there, Lord Frost, the former Brexit Minister. He was giving a speech today at UK in a Changing Europe. Let's welcome Lance Foreman, former Brexit Party MEP. You heard there what Lord Frost said, but in your mind, is the government making the most of Brexit?
I think it could be doing a lot more. When people voted for Brexit, they voted for a very significant change, a really bold change. And I don't think that the government has taken the bold moves that it could have taken to really seize the opportunities that Brexit provides.
And what are they?
Well, Liz Truss, to be honest, and Anne-Marie Trevelyan have been going around the world doing trade deals, and that's all very good and very good and well. But the thing we've really been missing is the deregulation. There were millions and millions of petty regulations that came out of sort of EU rules.
Can you name any of them?
And we haven't even made a start on deregulating the economy to free up small businesses. It's this, 90% of businesses in the UK are small businesses and family businesses, and we face exactly the same rules and regulations that we are facing under the EU, and nothing has been done on that front at all.
Go on.
So, but it's not just about those sort of opportunities. I'm also disappointed that we have a very strong Conservative government, 80-seat majority, and we are squandering the opportunities to make bold decisions about our economy, about our tax policy. We should be super competitive on corporations tax to increase investment. But instead, what has Rishi Sunak been doing? He's been negotiating minimum corporation tax rates with governments around the world. Our net zero policy is absolutely crucifying the nation. That is the main cause of the cost of living crisis. In my own business, we produce smoked salmon. In my own business, my electricity went up last October from £200,000 a year to £400,000 a year. It's very difficult to sell extra fish to cover that cost.
All right, Lance, stay with...
business around the country will be facing the same thing. And they've had to put up prices and say you have inflation.
All right, stay with us. Listen to the debate. What's your response to all of that in terms of the government making the most of Brexit, Hugh?
Well, I don't really sort of distinguish sort of Brexit legislation or EU legislation that we've brought in with the rest of our statute book. As far as I'm concerned, all laws should have a purpose, and if they've sort of missed their sell-by date, then we should look to take them down. Or we talked about productivity, but I mean, I can understand the argument because obviously a lot of EU laws were not originated by us in the UK, so therefore maybe some of them shouldn't need to apply. But I can't give you examples because as far as I'm concerned, we should look at all legislation and then say we can do more with it or we can take it down. I mean, funnily enough, I was actually working with Sharon Graham, who's now the leader of Unite, on the British Airways dispute, and she was talking about the need to reform our airport slots, and we can do that now we're outside of the EU. Now, I wasn't quite sure if that would work because of international rules, but it was interesting that it's not just those on the right of things that are actually looking at the sort of opportunities to do things differently. And there's nothing wrong with that. We have now left the EU. We should make sure that all of our laws are actually fit for purpose, and if not, actually take them down. But I wouldn't just say it's got to just be EU-based law. A lot of that EU-based law was good law.
Brexit opportunities, are they being made the most of?
Well, look, the UK may have voted to leave the European Union 6 years ago, but then there were years' worth of debating whether or not that decision would be listened to. And then when it finally was, we had a pandemic hit. So I would argue there hasn't actually been a lot of time to make good on the opportunities of Brexit. But there are two already that I think are just massive. And one is the UK's vaccine efforts and rollout. I appreciate that you could have done that within the European Union, But I think the chances would have been much, much smaller. The fact that the UK did storm ahead without any question as to whether or not it would couple up with the EU, implemented an amazing vaccine task force, I think is a real opportunity of Brexit. And as well, its leadership on Ukraine. You know, the fact that it didn't have to negotiate with anybody else, especially in the EU right now, France and Germany and their positions on Putin. The fact that it was just able to storm ahead and take the moral principled stance about being Ukraine's #1 ally. You know, in the words of President Zelensky, you know, has made Boris into a great friend and ally. Those were not his exact words, but it was something like that. I can't remember exactly what it was. But it's very clear that the UK has benefited from Brexit through its ability to be much louder and more bold on the foreign stage, and also through that vaccine task force.
Well, I think the thing is, though, that so many of the people making the case for Brexit originally were people like Lance, who were making a quite specific case, not just for leaving the European Union, but for deregulation and sort of closer alignment with the United States and Australia. And a big part of that was a trade deal with the US, which hasn't happened yet. And I think that's the that was sold as one of the big opportunities of Brexit, along with a large sum of money for the NHS. And those things haven't materialised. And so I suppose there were the specific things that a very core group of people wanted from Brexit that Lance was saying himself he's disappointed haven't happened. And then there are the sort of wider things. But I think it's just really clear that the Labour Party is not going to be making a case for rejoining the European Union anytime soon. There's actually just a consensus that's settled pretty much in British politics, apart from in smaller parties, that we're going to be living with Brexit for quite a long time. So the Labour Party is also, tasked with coming up with opportunities that it can seize, which I think is finding a bit tricky to do.
Well, Shami, what do you say to that?
What I think is, I kind of agree with a lot that's been said about people having voted for Brexit for different reasons and wanting different things on the other side. What I think has gone on with Mr Johnson and his government is that they've taken us in a populist far-right direction. And as you heard from
but what does that, sorry, in what way? Be more specific in terms of Brexit.
So we want deregulation of standards. We want to keep feeding the xenophobic beast. We want to move away from internationalism, whether it's the Refugee Convention or the Convention on Human Rights, because the beast will never be fed. These appetites to go it alone in the world will never be fed. Now, the vaccine programme was mentioned. Of course, there was a very positive story for those of us who've now been vaccinated 3 times, but we didn't take the opportunity to be an early adopter of the TRIPS waiver so that countries in the global south could share the recipes and get on with vaccinating their populations too, to save us from
let me just get
variants.
Lance to come back in terms of the comments by Shami Chakrabarti in terms of a right-wing xenophobic agenda, which is how she sees it.
Well, I think that's absolute nonsense. I mean, Boris Johnson's probably one of the most left-wing Tory leaders we've had since Ted Heath. But what Kate said is that, there have obviously been the benefits with the vaccines, with our, approach to Ukraine, but they were both reactions. They weren't part of a plan. And I sort of sense that this government is always reacting to things rather than actually being proactive and deciding policy. And as I said, the biggest crisis today is energy. We should be independent. We should not be reliant. If it wasn't for net zero policy, not just in the UK, but across Europe, Putin could never have started this war. We have become dependent on Russian oil and gas.
All right.
And ultimately, that has led to the inflation of goods because of prices going up. Our net zero policy is totally deranged.
All right, well, let me get Shami to come back because we haven't got long.
I think we could also have publicly owned utilities that would help you with your electricity bills in your small business, as you've described, But that would mean that that this public good of electricity wouldn't be lining the pockets of a few super rich people.
Lance?
Shami, I don't sort of totally. I am a free marketeer, but the resources under our feet are owned by the state. And what we keep hearing from government is, well, even if we frack, which I believe we should be doing, it won't make a difference to world market prices. They're right, it won't. But you can change the way this is done. We should have tenders going out to drill the shale gas.
Okay.
And there'll be companies doing that. but then the gas itself can be given at, free or at very low cost.
I'm going to have to stop. I'm going to have to stop you there because we're almost out of time. But thank you very much to Lance Foreman. Before we go, a reminder: we'll be on your screens on BBC Two earlier for most of next week because of Wimbledon. We'll be on air at the earlier time of 10:15 on Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday, and on Wednesday we'll be on at the usual time of 11:15 for Prime Minister's Questions. Thank you to all of my guests here. Make sure you set your alarm clock for next week. Bye bye.